Many people were surprised that Puss in Boots: The Last Wish had the ability to make them tear up or cry or just feel emotional. The surprise here being over the fact that it's an animated film that elicited such feelings. Not only is that unusual, but we were also talking about a sequel to a movie that barely anyone talked about, and yet it still ended up getting appraisal from the audience of all kinds and demographics. To someone who hasn't seen the film, that might look like a mystery. But a movie like this only achieves this kind of result when it puts together and cleverly plays with all of its elements to make the audience as emotionally invested in its characters as possible, and so they end up feeling for them and care for their every action and the overall story by extension. Puss in Boots stands out because it succeeds to evoke feelings of fear, anxiety, tension, sadness, and hope because it dares to go to places that are deep and dark narratively and aesthetically, and builds characters that have enough depth on multiple levels and that have to face conflicts that are easily relatable to the viewer. It did all of that while keeping it all balanced enough to appeal to both adults and children. So in this video, I'll go over everything it has done right to achieve that kind of result. I'll be including spoilers, so if you haven't watched it yet, this is your spoiler warning. You should go watch it right now. To understand how the film was crafted this well, let's start from the very beginning, the opening scene, where we're introduced to Puss as this unstoppable hero in an exaggeratingly optimistic way. The tone is very light, there's a lot of singing and cheering, but as the viewer, of course you know this ridiculously colorful picture will be shattered at some point, and something will go wrong introducing the conflict that will drive this story. The movie was aware of how powerful that conflict will be, and so it took some time to tease us a little bit by exaggerating Puss's heroism, by introducing fake villains that Puss defeats in a heartbeat, all while the real threat watches him amongst the spectators. And because Puss's powers seem to have gone so far, the downfall hits the hardest, as we learn that he now has the possibility to die permanently after he had wasted 8 of his 9 lives. The illusion of immortality is shattered. For death to be at the center of the conflict in an animated kids movie is already a level deeper than usual, and with the interaction Puss had with the doctor, I was already impressed that the movie was seriously taking that route. At that moment, a connection starts to develop, as death is something that we all think about and fear, but it's not really a complete connection because we can't truly relate to the unbeatable hero of all times, Puss in Boots. I mean, what does he know about it really? That's when the movie takes things a level deeper and goes on to show, rather than just tell, how relatable of a character he can be. And you know that storytelling is most compelling when you actually care about the main character, and so will dedicate your energy and attention throughout the story to root for them. What they introduced to ensure that is Puss's vulnerability, and a real-life demonstration of Puss's mortality through his encounter with the character of Death. That turns out to be a real threat to him that goes beyond dialogues and turns into action, a fight that Puss barely escapes and shows signs of anxiety over. That's when the stakes get higher, as we learn that mortality to Puss has become more than a possibility, but also an unsettling reality. And that is something we can understand, as anxiety over the reality of death is a feeling that we're all familiar with, and therefore we can empathize and connect with Puss. And again, that understanding goes beyond what we know and manifests in what we actually see. Puss's feelings were demonstrated best through his panic scene, which was raw and so accurate that it induces anxiety in the viewer as well. It was definitely an impressive direction to take, again, for an animated movie like this one. So the first thing that the movie does right within the first few minutes is setting a complex and nuanced protagonist that is easily relatable, and that's how every feeling he has is properly transferred to us as an audience. He's a flawed character that is arrogant and probably someone unpleasant to be around, even if he's fun to watch. Yet when opposing the elements of conflict in the story, we learn in more than one way how vulnerable and relatable he can be. What we primarily feel comes from a place of empathy for the character, yes, but there is another element that comes into play to help us put ourselves in his shoes even better, and that's the character of the wolf, the main villain in this film, technically. A lot of the hype around Puss in Boots comes from this powerful character that successfully manages to elicit the feeling of fear in the audience, children and grown-ups alike. On one level, he naturally does that thanks to the very thing that he represents, which is death. But also on a more concrete level, this is a genuinely truly terrifying villain. One of the major reasons for that is this morbidly beautiful whistle that announces his arrival. That is so brilliant as a device to give this villain a distinctive identity that will forever be memorable. There's also the design and overall presence of the character. It's a wolf, and that already puts him on some heightened level of fearful. There's also the red eyes, the calm and hauntingly confident voice, and the large terrifying aura and demeanor. Whenever this character shows up, you'll know for sure, not just because of the legendary whistle, but also because he leaves a mark on the space that he occupies, that is usually dark and dim. As far as his characterization goes, the wolf gets a lot of its power from the mystery that surrounds him. We don't know anything about him, and that makes it even more natural to fear him, and perfectly speaks to what he represents, as we mainly fear death because of how little we know about it. And by designing a character that was this vague and mysterious, the movie plays with our feeling of fear from the unknown. What we do actually know though, and what remains to see from this character, is only its terrifying side. And so in contrast to the vulnerability that we saw in Puss's character, what we saw in the wolf is power, dominance, and danger, which again is demonstrated through the strongest possible means to heighten the stakes, that being the sight of dripping blood. Another example that shows how the film does not hesitate to go all the way with its raw depiction of the dark elements of the story. Yet the most important layer we see in the wolf is revealed when he explains his motive behind wanting to kill Puss. An antagonist in a story is already powerful when they have a strong motivation, but in this movie, the motivation of the villain makes him all the more terrifying, not because it's something horrible or insane, but on the very contrary, it is reasonable. It is something that we can absolutely get behind. The Death Wolf wants to punish Puss because he doesn't value and respect his life. And so after the demonstration that we saw at the beginning of the arrogant and narcissist Puss, we are inclined to agree with Death that Puss deserves to be punished, and that adds an extra layer of terror to this character. It was very crucial for the movie to set this tone and high stakes in the very beginning, because that will be reflected in everything you see in the rest of the movie. From that moment on, it's true that things get less dark, but because of what was established at the beginning, you see the fun and goofy adventure that will follow in a totally different light and understand the character's depth. The first thing that benefits from this powerful build-up is the scene where Puss buries what he considered as his older, heroic self. Again, the fact that the film dared to depict such a scene alone deserves admiration, as it makes this character even more real. But it's all the more powerful thanks to the opening scenes. This moment of despair perfectly complements what preceded it because it stays true to a relatable character depiction, as despair and giving up and burying a part of oneself would be very natural and accurate under circumstances like this. And so that scene was heartbreaking to us because it was completely earned. There was enough build-up in the first segment of the movie to give a scene like this the ability to move us, even if it was very early on. At some point later, we get introduced to Goldilocks and her family of 3 bears, which in itself is quite interesting because of how they just so loosely incorporated a fairy tale within this story, in the series of this movie taking risks and breaking conventions. Technically speaking, the Goldilocks family is supposed to be another antagonist, as their desires and drive opposes that of Puss's. But on a deeper level, what we look at is a decent portrayal of the dynamics of a healthy and wholesome family, and the character's journey as she comes to accept what we can rightfully call a real, albeit found, family, and learn the universal lesson that the meaning of a true family goes beyond links through blood. This is not a very groundbreaking lesson, but what I loved about it in this film is the execution. In the beginning, we get the impression that those family members are truly the antagonists, as they looked fearsome and devoid of emotion, and by extension, personality. And you can see that from the way Goldilocks bossed them around. But then as soon as they go to Luna's house, their true essences start to come out. and we can see them as truly fleshed out and distinct characters. They all have traits that distinguish them from each other, but also are diverse enough to give each of them some livelihood. We see the father pulling out his soft and polite persona and then showing his talent in the piano, while the mother seems to be a little bit too aggressive, and because of that, you might think this is an obvious deliberate attempt to inverse gender roles. Then you see the mother also having an interest for fashion, which shows that these characters are just developed in more than one dimension. They're just different and are more than just their roles in the family. But in the same way they have their unique traits, that still doesn't mean that they can be relatable and reflect universal dynamics, like these siblings who are so typically mean towards each other and fight all the time, yet you know that at their core, they reserve the most care and admiration for each other. And if you ever had a sibling yourself, you know exactly what that feels like. And so in addition to Puss, we can form a connection with characters that not only are supposed to be secondary, but who also initially are antagonists. Again, the film just doesn't tell you all of this, but rather shows you that implicitly through their actions and dialogue as they go about their quest for the wishing star, which is a very good device to help us take a look at them at their truest selves by the end, as one's ultimate desire in life can reveal a lot about them. We've talked a lot about the intense feelings this film evokes, but it'd be foolish to gloss over the bright side of it all. For starters, other than the turning points in Puss's character, he's actually a fun and entertaining protagonist to follow. Additionally, he's supported by a cast of characters that we can say are added to give some sort of comic relief. At the top, we have Perrito's character, whose traits fulfill that role perfectly, as he seems to be no more than an embodiment of positivity and wholesomeness. He's so ridiculously optimistic and nice, and that adds a humorous sense to the story for the most part. I think we can also call Perrito a foil character, as his significance relies a lot on contrasting the main character to show his flaws. His positive vision and optimism allows us to see how gloomy the main character's vision is, and in a way points us towards one of his flaws. That is reinforced when we just so randomly hear Perrito's tragic backstory, which was a brilliant way to incorporate dark comedy here in the series of this film exploring areas darker than what you'd expect from a kids movie. But that's not the only way Perrito supports the protagonist, as he also plays a key role in one of the most important scenes in the film during Puss's panic attack, serving as the loyal and hopeful friend he is, in a way that is both accurate and also inspiring, and gives a loose idea on how important support in cases like these could be and how it can be provided. On the other hand, we have what is also another comic relief character, but one that is of a completely different kind. In the same way Perrito is an embodiment of the absolute good, Jack Horner is the embodiment of pure evil. Having a character like this feels refreshing, as it subverts this trend that a lot of animation movies have been following recently of giving villains a tragic backstory that informs their inclination to be evil. Not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but it's just nice to see something different every once in a while. A lot of the fun in following Jack's character comes from how he's just so ridiculously and unjustifiably evil and mean. Even when we get the chance to peek through his background, we see that every reason that might have gotten him to where he is now was completely eliminated. He'd had a perfectly healthy childhood, a lot of comfort and support, and yet ended up as a villain. The closest thing that might explain that is how he wasn't as successful as Pinocchio, which is not very convincing to justify everything he does, even when you look at it from his perspective. That only serves to prove he's always been so entitled. His motivations are also in line with this, as his end goal seems to be able to get the necessary power to dominate everyone by using the wishing star, basically wanting to become the ultimate figure of evil. Including Jiminy the Cricket to drive this point home was absolutely brilliant. It adds so much to the comedic side of it all, as the scenes with Jiminy ridiculously trying to redeem him were hilarious, and it also sets clear the fact that Jack is a character that is purely evil and finds utter pleasure in torturing others. Period. Watching Jiminy realize that himself the hard way was absolutely chef's kiss. Now, if we had Jack Horner as the only villain here, I maybe wouldn't have been saying the same thing. But because we already have two other antagonists, one to be taken seriously and genuinely be scared of, and one that is good at the core and gets redemption, the addition of this character that is sinister just for the sake of being sinister adds variety, life, and entertainment to the story. Kitty is another character that plays a key role in this movie, as she serves to reveal and show the personal side of the main character's conflict. On the one hand, she may feel like another antagonist, as her end goal seems to be at odds with the protagonist's goal, and so she presents really tough competition. But on the other hand, she's on Puss's side, both literally, as she accompanies him during his quest, and narratively, as she's part of a trio that faces another trio that represents the antagonists. Another reason why we don't really consider her as a villain is because she's a multi-dimensional and fleshed out character that we can relate to in the same way that we do with Puss. She's also a character that develops and goes through significant change herself after facing her own inner conflicts and overcoming her past. The difference here is that her conflict is interconnected with that of Puss's, and so another purpose she has was to be one of the powerful elements that contributed to the development of Puss's character as well. There's so much to appreciate in the way both these characters faced their hardships in the past was depicted, as it has variety and reflects two really fleshed out but different personalities. It was impressive how the conflict between them had been resolved, the way they confronted each other and maturely communicated, and the way Puss specifically finally came to face his own mistakes and flaws was very refreshing to see. You know, one of the reasons why this movie excels both in the eyes of adult and young fans is because of how it incorporated the story of Puss and Kitty by giving it the necessary depth and complexity and meaningfully building up to its resolution, all while making the ending border on a happy ever after type of ending. The happy feeling you get by the end over the beauty of love feels earned, like every other feeling this movie evokes, and so the story wraps on a note that feels genuine and compelling when in other scenarios we could have easily called it generic. But that's not the only part that wraps up perfectly. See, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish stands out and rightfully gets so much hype because it keeps the audience invested both emotionally and in the narrative itself by introducing a huge cast of characters that is already unusual for an animated movie as is, but it also manages to fully develop them and showcases their depth and complexity through meaningful arcs. The thing when you put so much effort into so many characters, the task of wrapping up all their arcs meaningfully and in a way that satisfies the audience becomes extremely harder. And yet this film still managed to pull it all off so well. And it wouldn't be this much appreciated if not for the powerful ending for each character that is consistent with their conflicts and motivations. Puss and Kitty find what they were looking for in each other, Goldilocks finds it in her found family, Perrito finally fulfills his wish of being named and getting true friends, and Jack Horner, as the pure villain he is, gets the ending that he deserves as well. All of these characters learn that real change and fulfillment of dreams comes not through an external object like a wishing star, but from within, through introspection and reflecting on their own selves. Even when it comes to the character of Death, the ending stays true to the core of his character. His motivation was not to kill Puss just for the sake of it, but instead he had a rational reason. And once Puss learned how to respect his life, the underlying motive of the Death Wolf was fulfilled, and so there was no need to kill Puss. In the same way, the other characters did not really need the actual wish to find fulfillment in their own lives. That brings us to the cherry at the top of this film, and that is the universal message behind it and the lesson that the main character learns after his journey to respect and appreciate the one life that he has, and most importantly, face the fact that he will never be able to defeat death, but instead could learn to live with it and accept it as a reality. It is a message that works well and wraps the story perfectly because it says something that speaks to us all, and that we need to be reminded of to feel a sense of peace. And that's what the film has given us. After a roller coaster of mixed emotions of fear, anxiety, sadness, and tension, the movie wraps itself up by giving us what we would naturally need the most after such a ride, and that is a sense of hope. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you like the content here. Now I've got to say goodbye and see you in another video.